I used to say, no, I don't have courage. I just look around for who's behind me and there's nobody there. So I have to do it because someone has to do it.
At the age of 23, Marilyn Waring became New Zealand's youngest member of parliament for her party. After serving 3 terms, she shifted her career to academia. There, she became known as a principal founder of feminist economics. Marilyn continues to fight to bring visibility and credibility to all forms of work done by women, while also empowering them to be the experts of their own livelihood. Thank you for joining Lynn Foley, host of Remarkable Women, Powerful Stories, as we hear from Marilyn about her journey.
I was born in Ngāruawāhia in New Zealand, and I grew up in a little village called Taupiri, which was probably 600 to 700 people, and I was probably related to half of them. And it just serviced an agricultural area. But Ngāruawāhia and Taupiri are also very important in New Zealand as the home of the Kingitanga, the Tainui people, and their urupa, their burial ground, is in Taupiri. So all my life I was surrounded by our Indigenous culture. And I went to primary school there, 2 different secondary schools, and then I chose to go to Victoria University in Wellington to study. I was very lucky. I was the first person on either side of my family in 4 generations in New Zealand to go to university, and we were also lucky in those years that if you'd been academically successful in secondary schooling, the government paid 9/10 of your fees and allowances, which is very different from what students are required to do these days. Though, of course, I logged up a very hefty lot of part-time work, you know, the waitressing,
Yep.
cleaning, delivering routine. I thought I wanted to do a law degree or a co-joint degree, and I'd studied languages at secondary school. First of all, in law class, in the full auditorium, there were only 3 women, and the men in the class laughed when we talked about infanticide and rape. So I didn't think I was going to last very long convivially in that situation. And just as a makeup, I had chosen political science 1. I'd always been interested in politics, always read the newspaper and followed the news. I had no idea what particular ideology my parents were, but I was interested. So I did political science 1, and of course, then that became my favorite subject. So
inevitable.
Yeah, well, political philosophy, political economy, anything with political in front that was a unit I could take, pretty much I took, and completed an honours degree there. However, also in those days, you were pretty much the person you went to sign for your coursework would sign anything, and you weren't prescribed. So during those 4 years, I'd also done music performance, 1, 2, 3, 4. And at the end of my honours degree, I went to London to study music. When I came home, the Women's Electoral Lobby, which is an organisation I know performed well in Australia, but the Women's Electoral Lobby was very strong in New Zealand in the 70s. And they were lobbying for more women members of parliament, and they were interviewing all the candidates. And I also had thought, oh, well, I'll seriously do a music degree. But my old prof, Alan Robinson, called me and said, there's a part-time job in the Opposition Research Unit in Parliament, and I want you to take it. So I took it. So I was doing music half the time and then this job. And I was enormously lucky to be asked to work for a man called George Gear, who was a real liberal. and a very special, hardworking member of parliament. And I learned phenomenal amounts from George. But we were heading for the 1975 election. The opposition party, National, had had 3 years in opposition without a woman in its caucus. There had only ever been 13 women members of parliament in New Zealand. And they were heading for the very last safe seat candidate selection. And it happened to be where I came from. So I thought, oh, well, I'll throw my name in, and at least then we'll be able to put the lie to the fact that both parties claimed they'd love to have more women if only women would offer themselves as candidates. So there were 11 in the primary. I definitely didn't expect to get through the primary. I did. I think I did it largely because at nights in the Parliament buildings, when I'd finished my work, I went down to the Parliamentary Library and I read 3 months back copies of the Cambridge Independent, the Te Awamutu Courier, the Huntly Press, and the Waikato Times. And the primary selection committee had said that they couldn't believe somebody who lived in Wellington knew more about the constituency than others. So I've always been a researcher, though, because that's,
Yes.
you know, like one of the questions you're going to ask is I love evidence. I love research. I'm very impatient with, you know, cliched dinner party conversations, having a pretension to be a knowledgeable debate about politics. And much to everybody's complete amazement, as a 22-year-old, I won the selection for one of the very safest seats in the country.
And subsequently was elected to Parliament in the election.
Well, you know, it was going to be pretty hard to lose that constituency.
Absolutely. But that's a coup in itself to actually get the pre-selection for a safe seat as a woman back in 1975 or 74. So during that time in politics, I know you were often the only woman in the room or at the decision-making table. How did you establish yourself, get your voice heard, and ensure that your ideas and opinions mattered?
Well, again, first of all, you use any device that's there that will offer you a reason for doing what you're doing. So the National Party had no party rules, about being required to conform with the majority decision of the National Party caucus. Labor did, Rule 242. So whenever I was arguing against the government on behalf of my constituents, which I made very clear at pre-selection I would do and have no problem doing, or when I argued against the government because the party won the election, with respect to women, I was always quick to remind the Parliament that in my party, I was lucky. I could do this, and you couldn't do this in opposition, you see. So it was kind of like, you know, I'm distinguishing my capacity for liberty and freedom inside this particular institution. So that was one way. And yes, I mean, I chaired the Public Expenditure Committee, the only woman in the room frequently. My second term from 1978 to 1981, I was the only woman in the governing party caucus. You have to choose your issues. You can't go to battle on everything. When other members of the caucus stood up to take the lead on a position that I held, I just let them do it. It was not necessary to be on my feet all the time. If somebody else was advocating, that was great. A lot of it was about also really assisting this myriad of women's organizations we had. We're in a pre-social media context. So letters, telegrams, facsimiles just coming on board. And I had huge mail outs to like 90 to 100 women's groups every fortnight, which would include not just things I was doing, but for example, every question in the House any woman member of Parliament was asking. And also with requests for them about what the most significant issues were that I was having problems with and where I needed their advocacy, etc. And we also, as a governing party, had inherited the recommendations of the Select Committee on Women's Rights. So there was going to be a lot of legislation as well. So there was also an endeavour to make it clear I was not making these things up. I was being publicly responsive to the demands of my constituency, or for example, the women's movement.
Yeah.
And my constituency is what kept me going. It was a terrible, battering place, even without social media. In the last few years, I definitely had problems with bulimia. I would run to work every morning and throw up, and there was nothing I could do about stopping it. And I frequently would get on the plane on Tuesday mornings and hide these silent tears behind dark glasses. I was extraordinarily depressed. But my constituency and their love for me and their support of me, no matter what, made a huge difference.
And so it carried you through those, and to use your word, battering time of politics.
Yeah.
And at a crucial, I mean, I suppose every era is crucial in terms of social development, isn't it? But the 70s were so incredibly crucial for women's rights, and the work that you were involved in, incredibly crucial as a backbone for a lot of the work that's going on today.
Yes, some of it was easier than others. Of course, if you're in a Conservative party, making heroic gains in matrimonial property is actually good, right? So it is good. Going backwards on reproductive freedom was not a problem for them. So, there would be some wins and, some losses. I think one of the most important things that really had me feeling okay about being there was the introduction of a universal superannuation scheme under that government. So at age 60, it's now 65, every person in New Zealand, whether or not they'd been in paid employment, was going to be paid way higher than the pension, was going to be paid something at many stages that people could live on. And women would have that if they'd been 24/7 full-time carers, if they've never been able to be in the paid workforce. And for me, that was a tremendous gain. And it's still really important today.
Incredibly important. So that leads me into the question about your work back in the 80s, in 1988, when you researched and published If Women Counted. And that was, as all of the online places describe, as the foundation for the discipline of feminist economics. Can you give us a short elaboration on the premise of that research and why it was so important in the world of economics and in national accounting in particular, and for the place of women's work?
Well, I came to chair the Public Expenditure Committee, and the truth is, I'd heard of the GDP, and of course it's earlier GNP. I'd never heard United Nations System of National Accounts. I'd never used the words gross national income. And here I am chairing this committee, and all of a sudden they bring legislation to the committee, very unusual for a budget committee to have, a change of statute in front of it. And it was about New Zealand changing something called its boundaries of production to comply with this system. And I don't know, maybe I thought that New Zealand just had their own system and that there wasn't a universal one that was imposed on everybody. So I started to ask questions. And of course, I had recognized that, in our policy planning, a really obvious thing always is, if a government moves to save health funds by earlier discharge from hospital, And you're always going, oh, yeah, so who then is going to do the caring? Because the answer is obvious. So you knew that this vast number of women, and in the 70s and 80s, overwhelmingly the majority, were not in full-time paid employment. And yet I watched my grandmothers and my mother, and they were busy all the time. They were highly productive. They were performing services for other households, for the community. They worked longer days than the men they were married to. I could see this, right? So I started to ask questions about the system of national accounts. And yes, there was a paragraph that said my grandmothers and my mother were non-primary producers. That's what the generic description was. And that their work was, quote, of little or no importance. And that struck me in the deepest place, in my gut, in my heart, in my brain. And I just determined, as soon as I am out of this place, I am going to get to the bottom of this. So after I resigned from Parliament, I wrote a book proposal that was assisted by a wonderful Australian, Elizabeth Reed, and I got a book contract. And so for the next 2 years, I wrote Counting for Nothing, which is also called If Women Counted. When I went to the UN Library in New York, Katerina Bovan, who was the deputy librarian, showed me to the shelves of encyclopedic volumes of rules for the system of national accounts, and told me that apart from their original author, Sir Richard Stone, and she had been in the library for some 20 years, nobody else had ever asked to see them. And I started on volume 1 and I read the whole lot all the way through. And I think one of the significant parts of this, why am I in New York? Because neither New Zealand nor Australia hold a complete copy of the rules by which our national income and economy is governed. And so you say to yourself, this is interesting. This huge system, nobody has to read the rules to know what's operating. Then what's operating is a system of propaganda. And that's exactly what I found. The system of national accounts omitted all unpaid work. Originally, that included all subsistence work. They pretended that all women's unpaid work was household confined, but in Zonta, with your work in the developing world, you'll know that actually the space between the household and its environments and the interdependence of what goes on in both means you can't actually prescribe women's roles to households without their environs. But also, of course, the environs weren't counted either. So the complete planetary ecosystems were omitted unless you were mining them, deforesting them, despoiling them. So all of the features we now recognize in the issue during the issue of climate change as being universally important for all of us. When I wrote Counting for Nothing, it was universally important to mine and destroy them to get higher growth.
So that leads me into the work that you have done more recently, I guess. It's in 2022, UN Women published a report on climate. I'll just read you a little quote. Gender inequality coupled with the climate crisis is one of the greatest challenges of our time. It poses threats to ways of life, livelihoods, health, safety and security for women and girls around the world. I'm wondering if you can share your views about that and the potential solutions for the disproportionate impact that we already know climate change is having on women and girls worldwide.
Well, I do think that solutions, if you belong to a group of people who are rendered invisible or simply not included, then some of the most important change is community change. You come up from under. You don't wait for, the central leadership to do anything. You're there forever. So I guess particularly in some of the PhD work in developing countries that I've supervised, you in particular see when women's groups work together, they can make incredible changes. I'm thinking back a couple of decades to one of the Nobel Peace Prize winners, Wangari Maathai, for example, and the reforestation movement that she was engaged in Africa. But so frequently, you have to build the respect for their own skills among those women, right? You have to build the confidence that they, who notice these things every day, are the experts on what climate change is doing right here in their community, not somebody in national HQ. They observe more, they learn more, they know more. And even if they're pre-literate, they still know more, right? And to somehow or other to have them believe in that competence and critical analysis, right? To move from that and not wait for local government to fund them and not wait for central government to change their promises, but how can they move forward? Very frequently, the most disempowered have been kept, of course, in conditions of dependency. So that again immobilizes them. One of the first things I've always said to students when they've walked into my room from places I've never been with questions that are dynamite, but I know very little about, is to say to them, as we progress through these next 3 or 4 years, I will remain the expert on how to get a PhD. You will become the international expert on your thesis question. And it's a great privilege because I will be taught by you. And to have them have that confidence from the very beginning, it's exactly the same message, I think.
So do you think that's a broad message for women and girls generally? Because one of the things that I hear in the work I do with women is they say, how do I build more confidence? How do I get my voice heard? How do I take more risks in my learning? And that risk taking that maybe doesn't seem to be in the DNA of all women and girls historically or even currently. So do you think, have you got any other thoughts on how women can focus on building their own confidence and then supporting women around them?
Think of how swift of foot women who were subsistence farmers had to be when COVID arrived, right? The markets aren't available, the whole thing changes. Well, I'm supervising one thesis where the women moved immediately, very bravely, to a range of organic vegetables because they knew, right, they weren't going to require the inputs, etc. That people would pay a premium for the organic vegetables, that they wouldn't have to produce as many, that they weren't going to have to wait months and months to see if a crop was successful. So they had a number of plantings, right? And if one wasn't going very well, it got tossed out and another. Well, when the COVID period passed, they stayed organic vegetable producers because there was much more in it for them, you know, and they liked the light-footed capacity they now had, not to be, you know, 6 months dependent on this rice or maize or sorghum or whatever it was. And again, that's about them, because nobody was going to help them, having to work it out themselves and then growing in confidence because they could see the results. So it's very similar to the way that I supervise a PhD. You're the experts. Come on, you're the experts. You're the ones who've got 17, 20, 30 years of watching what happens to this soil and this climate and everything else. You know, you can teach others.
Yes. And that's really interesting, isn't it? That it's that resilience and independence and believing that we are the expert in whatever narrow or broad field that we live and work in, whether it's in that space that you're discussing in subsistence farming, whether it's in any discipline or in the household or in parenting. It's having that confidence, and that seems to underscore how we make a change in the world, perhaps, Marilyn.
Yeah, and sometimes for, the big white colonizer to get out of the way. I've always seen any of my development program work as being transmitting everything and as much as I know and my strategic ideas to the people who will remain living in the country, as opposed to, Marilyn Waring writing some hotshot independent consultant report. No, it's not the way I operate. If I'm going to Nepal or Indonesia or wherever, one of the Pacific Island states or something, no, the people who live there are already the experts. I've got some skills and I can facilitate more advocacy and more strategic intervention. It's not mine, and it can only happen if they see how to engage with it and choose how to engage with it. So sometimes us getting out of the way is pretty important.
So in a similar light, but a different topic, in the area of human rights and therefore gender-based violence and matters affecting women more than men, what do you think needs to happen to take us a bit closer to the reduction and or eventual elimination of gender-based violence? Because I know here in Australia we have horrific figures of death through intimate partner violence, and it's similar across many countries of the world. What's your view on that at this time of your career?
Well, it's probably one of the saddest and most hurtful things to have spent 70 years, battling as a feminist, and to feel that there's a space where, God, 1 in 3, 1 in 5 women are abused, and that in all of that time and with all your ideas, you've never really been able to make inroads, except in that women give voice to it more now. And it's a tragedy, and I don't, right, one of the most important things, and I've seen a little bit of this in Australia, is when men understand that it's their job to be on the front line with other men and to say, now cut it out, Sam, that's completely unreasonable, and that's not how people like you should behave, or just really being in the front line, stepping in front of, there's so much observation goes on of all of this, and women can't do this on their own. And we've been trying so desperately, from, trying to bring up better boys to changing laws to ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, refuge and rape crisis centres, all of these developments in my lifetime. But really, we're just not cracking through to have men regard women as equals and not as something they can batter. So I think it's really time for men to step up much, much more, really in the front line, and to take that front line with their brothers who don't behave.
And I talked to a young woman the other day who said her 18-year-old brother is now calling it out among his friends due to some, family situation that he was on the sidelines of. So it's the calling out, isn't it, and the naming and the awareness building of all forms of gender-based violence. Violence isn't just battering, it's emotional battering, psychological battering, etc. But yes, I agree with you. It's a lot of disappointment, isn't there, when we talk about it at our time of life and career of not being where I think we all thought we might be. But it is having men working with women, it's side by side. So thank you for sharing those thoughts. Where do you think you've made the biggest impact throughout your career?
We'll say, particularly the work in GDP, and that's been, it happened really early. I was in my late 20s, I think, and the Canadian documentary it's huge. It's been shown all over the world, so that's made a significant difference. the boundary of production has changed and satellite accounts have been set up. But all of the movement in that direction is not good, because it continues to think that the dollar is all valuable and that you can commodify all the services of the environment and all the work that women do, and you simply can't. Environmental characteristics can be measured in terms of their own integrity. We can tell whether or not the suspensions in the air are up or down. We don't need to find out a market figure for it. Similarly with water pollution and all the rest, the loss of forests, we no need to have any market indicators around that. And the amount of work that women do, if it was ever truly, properly valued, would in fact overrun the GDP, because different countries' accounts could not cope. They're always understated. They're always understated because the kinds of, as they called, household work that are included are all phrased as things like washing and laundry, or transportation to and from, or cooking and etc., or caring for, right? So I always say, first of all, okay, so where's all the management, administration, IT expertise, banking, all of that? So that's going on at the same time too, haven't you noticed? Then there's the whole simultaneity of activity. You know, especially these useless IT survey, time use surveys, they're just offensive because they're so useless. But so they never collect simultaneous activities. And most women I know think that they're inefficient if they're not doing at least two things at once.
That's right.
And also what is completely excluded, and there is now some really good supporting academic evidence around this, is worry work. Women do all the worry work to run households. Who's going to be where? Who needs what? Who's going to transport whom to where? What you need to take to school? What's going to be in your lunch? I mean, the worry work is just constant, and it's never ever recognised either. So we just continue to have these suggestions that women's unpaid work might be anywhere between, say, 25 to 50% of the GDP. It's always bigger. It's always bigger, you know, and these crude little economic instruments that they use to try and measure it are just outrageous. We've just had a major report in New Zealand on Māori women and the economy. And yes, it uses all the bad tools. However, it does indicate that Māori women's unpaid work is higher than their paid work, right? And contributes more to what really is the national economy than their paid work. So until we're recognised in that way, the distribution of revenue from a government is always going to leave us out. For example, in New Zealand, there is now a pay-as-you-go superannuation scheme. One of the things I advocate is that the moment you have the child, quite apart from maternity leave and parental leave and childcare availability and everything else, the government should, right at that moment, begin paying your KiwiSaver contributions. You're working. The offensive words that they use, like social capital and labour capital, in spite of the fact that you don't lie there and think, oh, goodness, look, I've just, you know, had a baby and to our labour and social capital. The fact is that without reproduction, the economy is going nowhere. So let's start investing in it from the very beginning.
And so if we were to elongate the discussion, which we can't, but that notion of, so that then is a big contributor to the place of women in society. And then we can extrapolate that further to what we've already discussed today around human rights and gender-based violence and climate change, etc. It's just such a core recognition of women's work, isn't it?
It starts just the very first addressing inequities in terms of income. You know, frankly, this is a far more important contribution you're making. You know, so let's acknowledge and reward it.
Absolutely. So what do you think, as we move to a close, Marilyn, what do you think your greatest leadership gifts are?
Well, I don't know. The woman who succeeded me in Parliament, Catherine, was my electorate secretary for some years. And she used to say I had courage. And I used to say, no, I don't have courage. I just look around for who's behind me and there's nobody there. So I have to do it because someone has to do it. So, and fear, I had loads of fear. There was always plenty of revenge and punishment goes on in Parliament. So, you know, I think one of the most important things since then is really my academic work and convincing more than 70 masters and PhD students that I've supervised to completion, that they were making this amazing contribution and that they would be able to work at a level they would never have guessed before. But one of the most important things, I think, was taught to me by a woman called Maria de Lourdes Pinto-Silgo. And after what was called the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, she became the interim president as they moved to democratic elections. And she was the one who really instilled in me thinking about the dynamic of power. And we all grow up thinking that the dynamic of power is about power over, you know, power of other people to influence and make rules and push us about and make us feel powerless, etc. And she said, no, there's nothing wrong with the word power. It's about the dynamic. So there can be power with others and power for others and power to do things. And if in our minds we can create a different preposition or a different idea of the dynamic of power, then we can work with others to change things and not feel like we're stuck in a corner.
Marilyn, a message for everyone as we close today. Do you have a message to anyone who's listening and watching today?
Yeah, collect your evidence, always be evidence-based, gather others of a like mind and move forward.
Marilyn, I've had the best conversation with you today. Zonta International thanks you wholeheartedly as one of our international honorary members for your generosity of time today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, Lynn.